This discussion deals with an issue that is currently most prominent on the international arena, namely the Russia-Ukraine war. This war has raised regional and global concerns as regards the possibility that it may expand and lead to a new devastating world war. Given Russia's insistence on continuing the war until it achieves its goals, and the West's insistence on punishing Russia and maximizing the cost of its war, it also raises a lot of questions concerning the various strategic, economic, and political repercussions of this war for the region and also the entire world. It has been more than 10 days since Russia launched its invasion, or what it likes to call a special military operation, into Ukraine. We've witnessed the devastations of Ukrainian cities, the mounting casualties, and military losses from both sides. Unfortunately, the war's ripple effect has gone beyond and threatened the regional and global strategic and economic status quo, and our region is not isolated from the fallout. Most importantly, the world faces yet another humanitarian crisis, with a crippling and worn-out global aid system. According to the UN Refugee Agency, 160,000 people have been displaced within Ukraine, and more than 2 million have crossed the borders already. The UN fears the number of those internally displaced will ultimately reach 7 million, and 7 million more refugees.
Ukraine wanted to become part of NATO, it resisted it, as long as there was pro-Russian government in Ukraine. However, in 2014, when pro-Russian president of Ukraine refused to sign a treaty with European Union, there was a popular demonstration in Ukrainian capital. The guy was stopped. Now Russians see it as a coup, and they moved in, and at this point they annexed Crimea. The second thing that they did, they wanted to create a situation which would allow them to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO.
A look back in history indicates that Russia, or Putin in particular, does not seemingly take into account US military actions in his own decision-making. If you look at 2014, under the Obama administration, the US was fighting in Afghanistan and Russia attacked Ukraine. In 2008, under George W. Bush, the US was fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, and Russia attacked Georgia. So in that sense, not really a calculus.
First and foremost, what do we see? We see a very strong and one of the most serious sanctions regime exercised in relation to Russia. We see sanctions which are having a legal character, right? We see sanctions which are unilateral, bilateral in relation to Russia, as well as they are organizational, coming from various international organizations, governmental, as semi-governmental, non-governmental, starting from including organizations such as various football unions, for example, and including various business corporations. We also see what we call lawfare, right? So Ukrainian side, as well as international organization, adopting various condemning resolutions, declarations, which can amount to a body of international law forming in relation to the situation in Ukraine. What do we know here? First and foremost, of course, it's United Nations. United Nations has 3 processes going on right now, what I've counted. It could be more, and it could be that I've missed. So we have a relative stalemate within the Security Council for obvious reasons. We have a condemnation of the situation within the General Assembly, and we also have a process within the Human Rights Council, the investigation that will be going on into the situation. We have a litigation in the International Court of Justice between Ukraine and Russia, and a request for preliminary measures, a request that, according to my research, will not be fulfilled by Russia because historically, since the founding of the Court of the United Nations, even when the Soviet Union was part of it, the Soviet Union never officially recognized the jurisdiction of the court and never followed up on the sanctions. And other great powers have also a reputation of not doing so as well, so it's not surprising. We have a process within the European Court of Human Rights where Ukraine has again applied against Russia. We have a process within various international organizations, for example, Interpol, where Ukraine has requested for Russia to be expelled, and where Interpol has said that it's not an easy matter, right? Legally speaking, these things take time and quite sophisticated and complicated procedures. So we have, of course, we have a process within the European Union, individual as well as collective reactions to the Russian action. That's in terms of various legal and institutional reactions. What do we have in terms of emerging and interesting, noteworthy alliances? We have a very interesting reaction to Brexit. So somehow it seems that Brexit, which was so significant recently, does not make that much of a sense anymore, because UK has found itself in a very, very different situation. And as we see, United Kingdom is actually very seriously engaged in the processes in the continental Europe. We also see processes within the European Union. As we know, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia have put forward their countries as candidates for membership. And we will see processes that are taking place quite speedily. I would say, and as we see from reports and assessments, candidacy is likely, but membership, of course, is a tough and very, very long process. What we also see is a new possible military alliance in Europe. Experts write about possible union or collective action between Poland, Ukraine, and UK. And that was initial reaction in relation to the lack of speedy action from NATO in the very beginning. We also are watching very interesting developments in the East in terms of joint naval exercises between China, India, and Russia, something to definitely watch for. And we have to pay attention what will happen to the nuclear deal and whether a nuclear deal will somehow come into play in relation to pressure on Russia.
I think the reason SWIFT becomes a problem for Russia is that it cannot move its funds overseas. Now, they may have already been sanctioned, but it cannot move anything that it controls. Now, SWIFT does not move the funds itself. All it is a standardized messaging system. Technically speaking, if the Russian central bank wanted to email a bank where its funds were being held overseas, it could go through that process, but the due diligence and the verification system make trade and everything very, very slow. And that's one of the reasons why the SWIFT system essentially exists.
So like I said, this is where, accordingly, there are two main repercussions for the different players within the region, as I see it. The first one being through oil, and the second one through wheat. And the oil and wheat are the two most important Russian exports currently being compromised by the conflict. So let's begin with the first one, which is oil. Oil is obviously the most obvious link between the crisis and the region. When the EU, the UK, and later the US and Japan issued sanctions on Russia late last month, their actions, as well as the instability derived from the conflict, affected the international markets, the energy markets specifically. In 2020, Russia was the third largest producer of oil after the US and Saudi Arabia, exporting around 5 million barrels of oil per day. However, the sanctions imposed in February upset the markets, causing a price hike. This hike came as a result of two things, the first being a perceived potential threat of a supply shock, and the second is a very tightly balanced oil market.
A number of scenarios, 3 or 4 at the most, that will also get into the question of whether what we're seeing in the energy markets driven by the conflict is a temporary phenomenon, or whether there is a transformative aspect to the energy, the markets and the industry and the various dynamics that affect the world. So the first scenario is what we're seeing currently. We're all following it on the news. We have Russia under considerable economic pressure. Sanctions until very recently had carve-outs for energy, didn't affect Russian trade. I think a couple of days ago the US government and the British PM stepped up the pressure. The second scenario would represent very simply an extension of the current US and UK position to the European bloc. It isn't a done deal, so to speak. Doesn't seem imminent for reasons that we'll get into in just a second. But the argument on the table was to extend the block on Russian hydrocarbon, so gas and crude oil exports to European countries. No more Russian cargoes from the Black Sea purchased by Europe.
With the idea that what happens if Russia will eventually succeed in its maximalist goals and invades the whole of Ukraine, that would Putin stop there? Many of Russia's neighbors, including my country, Finland, indeed thinks that that may not be the case. Russia may indeed continue with its wars to other neighboring countries. History indeed suggests that that might be the case. Putin himself references that he seeks to recreate the Russian Empire, and that gives a lot of worry to a lot of Russia's neighbors. Similarly, discussing Russian Empire's borders and in modern world, that will bring Russia immediately in conflict with NATO. This conflict is not just about Russia and Ukraine anymore. Belarus is effectively already a warring party. There's quite a lot of evidence already that Transnistria is also already involved in the conflict. What are Russia's designs for others, these neighboring countries, including Moldova, Georgia, other countries in Caucasus and Central Asia, and indeed also in Finland and Sweden, the two European countries that are not members of NATO? An old maxim, if you will, states that Russia will only stop when it meets a sufficient countervailing power. And that is indeed what NATO is now building in Eastern Europe. What Putin tried to achieve with the invasion of Ukraine, to ensure that Ukraine won't be part of NATO and that NATO would not indeed expand to Eastern Europe,